The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the small neighborhood. George Miller, a 75-year-old man, was out for his usual afternoon ride. His old bicycle creaked under his weight as he pedaled slowly down the quiet street. He loved the calmness of the neighborhood, the peacefulness of the trees swaying in the breeze, and the occasional wave from neighbors who recognized him. At his age, George had learned to appreciate the simple things in life, the beauty of a sunset, the chirping of birds, and the quiet moments when time seemed to slow down. Today was no different. He had spent the morning in his garden, tending to his flowers and vegetables. Now he was enjoying a leisurely ride on his bike, his thoughts drifting from one thing to another. He wasn't in a rush, and he wasn't thinking about anything special. It was just one of those peaceful afternoons that made him feel grateful for the life he had lived. But as he turned a corner and headed toward the local park, something unexpected happened. A police car, its lights flashing and siren blaring, pulled up beside him. The officer inside, a man in his 30s with a stern look on his face, rolled down his window and called out to George, "Hey, stop right there." The officer ordered. George, startled by the sudden interruption, braked and brought his bike to a stop. He had never been in trouble with the law before, and the commanding tone of the officer made him feel uneasy. "Is something wrong, officer?" George asked politely, his voice trembling slightly. "You know why I stopped you?" The officer barked, his eyes narrowing as he scanned George from head to toe. George was confused. "No, sir, I was just riding my bike. I don't think I did anything wrong." The officer didn't seem to care about George's confusion. Instead, he stepped out of the car and walked toward the elderly man. His name was Officer John Hayes, and he had earned a reputation for being quick to judge people, especially when it came to individuals he didn't like or understand. George had no way of knowing that Officer Hayes had already made up his mind about him, based purely on the way he looked, his age, his race, and the fact that he was a senior citizen riding an old bicycle. "You're riding through this neighborhood without any real reason," Hayes said, crossing his arms. "You know, people like you don't belong around here. You should go back to wherever you came from." George's face flushed with confusion and hurt. He had lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years. He had raised his children here, worked hard to build a life, and had contributed to the community in countless ways. The words stung, but George didn't react immediately. He had always believed that the best way to deal with anger was to stay calm. So instead of arguing, he simply asked, "I've been riding here for years. What's the problem?" Hayes looked at George with an icy glare, as though he couldn't believe George had the audacity to question him. "The problem is that you don't belong here. You think you can just ride around like you own the place?" George's heart began to race. He had never experienced anything like this before. Sure, there were some people who weren't very friendly, but he had always managed to avoid any real trouble. Now, though, it seemed as if this officer was looking for a reason to cause trouble. "Look, officer, I'm just trying to get some fresh air." "I'm not bothering anyone," George said, his voice trembling more now, but Officer Hayes wasn't interested in listening. He had already made up his mind. He wasn't just going to let George go peacefully. Without warning, he reached forward and shoved George hard, causing the elderly man to lose his balance and fall to the ground. The world seemed to spin for a moment as George crashed to the pavement. His bike clattered beside him, and his body ached as he tried to push himself up. The pain in his knees was sharp, and his hands scraped the rough concrete. He could feel the blood rushing to his face, but it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from the shock of what had just happened. An officer of the law, someone who was supposed to protect people, had just shoved him down without any warning or reason. The onlookers who had been standing on the sidewalk suddenly became aware of what was happening. Some of them turned away quickly, unsure of how to react. Others, though, stood frozen, eyes wide with disbelief. No one had expected this. George, an old man simply out for a bike ride, had been treated with cruelty by the very person who was supposed to uphold justice. As George struggled to get up, Hayes took a step back, watching him like a hawk. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before riding around here," He said coldly, as if the entire situation were somehow George's fault. George didn't answer. His body was sore, but more than anything, his heart was heavy. He had been taught to respect authority, to believe that the law was there to protect him. But in this moment he felt nothing but fear and confusion. What had he done to deserve this? He finally managed to sit up, his knees aching, and looked up at Hayes. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he still didn't want to make things worse by saying something he would regret. He simply looked at the officer, trying to gather the strength to speak, but before he could say anything, Hayes turned around and began walking back toward his patrol car. "I'm done with you," Hayes muttered, his back turned to George as he climbed into the driver's seat. "Stay out of my way." George watched as Hayes drove off, the sound of the engine growing quieter with every passing second. The pain in his knees was real, but the emotional wound from the officer's actions ran much deeper. He stood up slowly, using his bike for support, and began to make his way home. Little did he know the peaceful afternoon he had set out to enjoy was about to take a very unexpected turn. In the distance, a pair of eyes had been watching everything unfold, and those eyes belonged to someone who was not about to let what had just happened go unnoticed. Captain Sarah Reynolds was not an ordinary person. She wasn't just a soldier. She was someone who believed deeply in justice and fairness. Born into a family with a long history of military service, Sarah had always been driven by a sense of duty to protect others. But as much as she loved her country and respected the Army, she had also grown disillusioned by the systemic problems she had seen in some places. She knew that corruption and prejudice could happen anywhere, even within the institutions that were supposed to keep people safe. That afternoon, Sarah was off duty. She had just finished a long shift at the base and was enjoying some time off, walking through the park in the neighborhood near her home. She liked to take walks to clear her head, the quiet atmosphere giving her a sense of peace after a long day. As she walked, she passed a small street where George Miller had been riding his bike just moments earlier. It was then that she saw the police officer's car and the elderly man lying on the ground. At first, she didn't know what had happened. All she could see was George struggling to get back on his feet, his bike scattered on the ground beside him. The officer, who had shoved the elderly man, was walking back to his car, not even giving George a second glance. The officer's behavior made Sarah's stomach churn. She didn't know the full story, but she didn't need to. The look on George's face, the way he was holding his knees as if in pain, told her everything she needed to know. Captain Reynolds paused for a moment, watching the scene unfold. She wasn't someone who liked to intervene unless she had to, but this situation felt different. There was something about it that didn't sit right with her. She had seen enough injustice in her career, and she wasn't about to let this one slide. She couldn't stand by and let an elderly man be mistreated without doing anything. With a deep breath, Sarah turned her attention away from the scene for a moment and took out her phone. She quickly tapped out a message to a few trusted contacts back at the military base. She explained what she had seen, the officer's blatant disrespect for the elderly man, the unnecessary violence, and the racist undertones she had sensed in the officer's words. Sarah knew that her message needed to be clear. She wasn't just going to let this go. She wanted to make sure that what had happened to George didn't go unnoticed. Within minutes, her phone buzzed with replies. Sarah's contacts in the military were just as concerned as she was, and they assured her that action would be taken. She didn't waste any more time. She turned back toward the street where the incident had occurred and began to walk quickly. Sarah didn't need to be a police officer to know when something was wrong, and right now, she could feel that something wasn't right with how Officer Hayes had treated George. By the time Sarah reached the street, the officer was sitting in his patrol car, the engine idling as he glanced at the rearview mirror. He looked relaxed, as though nothing had happened. He wasn't concerned about the man he had just shoved to the ground. Instead, he was just waiting for the right moment to drive off. But Sarah had a different idea. She wasn't about to let him leave without facing the consequences of his actions. She made a quick call to her military colleagues and made sure they were ready. She explained that she needed their help immediately and told them that the situation was more serious than it seemed. This wasn't just a matter of a disgruntled citizen. This was about an officer abusing his power and using his position to harm an innocent person. The urgency in her voice was enough to get their attention. Sarah wasn't acting alone. She had the support of people who understood the gravity of the situation. In no time, she received word that a convoy of military trucks was being prepared to head to the scene. This wasn't going to be an ordinary intervention. Sarah was determined to make sure that what had happened to George didn't go unpunished, and she was prepared to take whatever steps necessary to ensure that justice was done. As she waited for the military trucks to arrive, she kept a close eye on Officer Hayes, who was still sitting in his car. She was carefully observing him, trying to determine his next move. He didn't seem to care much about what had happened. He appeared to be going through the motions, waiting for the situation to blow over. But little did he know Sarah and her military contacts were about to change everything. The military convoy, which consisted of 15 trucks filled with highly trained soldiers, was soon on its way. The trucks rolled through the neighborhood with precision, their tires kicking up dust as they made their way to the street where George and the officer were. The sight of the convoy quickly drew the attention of the neighbors and onlookers. People were already starting to gather on the sidewalks, murmuring among themselves. It was clear that something big was happening. As the trucks arrived at the scene, Sarah stood on the sidewalk, her eyes locked on Officer Hayes. She could see the look of confusion beginning to spread across his face. The last thing he had expected was to be surrounded by military personnel for pushing an elderly man off his bike. His smug attitude shifted, replaced by nervousness as he realized that something far beyond his control was unfolding. The military trucks stopped, and soldiers began to disembark, forming a perimeter around the area. The presence of the military was overwhelming. Hayes couldn't help but feel a wave of panic wash over him. He had thought he was just getting away with pushing around an old man, but now the situation had escalated in a way he never could have imagined. Sarah walked up to Officer Hayes, her face calm but firm. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she spoke with a quiet authority that immediately commanded respect. "Officer Hayes," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly, "you are not free to leave. You're being detained for questioning." Hayes stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing as he tried to process what was happening. He had never imagined that his careless actions would lead to this kind of response. He had pushed an old man, no less, and now the military had shown up, surrounding him in a way that felt both surreal and terrifying. "What is this?" Hayes asked, his voice shaky as he looked around at the soldiers. "What's going on here?" Sarah's gaze was unwavering as she replied, "You're under investigation for misconduct. The way you treated that elderly man is unacceptable, and you'll be held accountable for your actions." Hayes tried to protest, but Sarah wasn't interested in hearing excuses. She had already made up her mind. The military was there for a reason, to make sure that George's voice was heard and that Officer Hayes didn't get away with his behavior. Sarah's determination was unshakable, and she was ready to ensure that justice would prevail. At that moment, George, still shaken but now safe from the officer's influence, stood at the edge of the crowd. He watched as the soldiers carefully surrounded the officer, making sure that no harm would come to him as the investigation began. George had no idea that the military had intervened on his behalf, but he knew that something had changed. The world felt different now, like the balance of power had shifted. He no longer felt as though he was alone. The injustice he had faced was being taken seriously, and that gave him a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. As the soldiers continued to secure the area, Sarah's phone buzzed with updates from her colleagues. The operation was in full swing, and Hayes would soon face the consequences of his actions. Sarah knew that this was only the beginning, but she was satisfied knowing that George had been given the protection he deserved. In that moment, Sarah realized that sometimes standing up for what's right requires more than just words, it requires action. And she was ready to take whatever steps necessary to ensure that justice would always prevail. The military trucks were now parked all around the street. their engines humming quietly as soldiers moved with precision, setting up a secure perimeter. The once quiet neighborhood had turned into a scene that no one could have predicted. People who had been walking their dogs or chatting with neighbors were now standing outside, watching in awe. No one had expected such a strong military presence in their peaceful community, especially for something as seemingly small as an argument between a police officer and an elderly man. Yet, as the minutes passed, it became clear that this was no ordinary situation. Officer Hayes, still in his patrol car, had started to realize that things were spiraling out of his control. He had assumed that pushing an old man off his bike would be a simple action, one that would be forgotten in no time. But now, surrounded by soldiers and with military trucks parked everywhere, he could see that something was very wrong. His heart began to race, his fingers twitching as he reached for the door handle to get out of the car. Sarah Reynolds stood across from him, her arms crossed in front of her chest. She was calm but firm, her expression showing no sign of doubt or hesitation. She had seen injustice before, but this was different. Officer Hayes was not just another officer with a bad attitude. He had crossed a line, and Sarah was determined to ensure that he would face the consequences of his actions. As Hayes slowly opened the door of his patrol car, a few of the soldiers moved toward him, positioning themselves in a way that showed they weren't going to let him escape. He was trapped. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. Was he being arrested? Was he going to be charged? All he had done was shove an old man, right? That was all it was. Why was this such a big deal? But Sarah knew that this wasn't just about one incident. It was about a pattern of behavior, about a system that allowed officers to abuse their power without consequences. It was about making sure that people who mistreated others were held accountable. Officer Hayes had used his badge as a shield, thinking it would protect him, but now it was clear that the system he thought he could hide behind was finally being challenged. Sarah walked toward him slowly, her boots clicking softly on the pavement with every step. Her eyes never left his. Hayes had his back turned, but he could feel her presence growing stronger, like a storm gathering in the distance. There was no escaping this. He could no longer act as if nothing had happened. "Step out of the car, Officer Hayes," Sarah said in a steady voice. There was no room for negotiation in her tone. Hayes hesitated, his hand still on the door. He had been a cop long enough to know the power of authority, but now, in the face of military intervention, he felt smaller than ever. He had always believed that wearing the badge meant he was above the law, but this was proving him wrong. I don't understand what's going on here," Hayes stammered, still trying to hold on to some semblance of control. "This is ridiculous. I'm just doing my job." Sarah's gaze didn't soften. "No, officer, you're not doing your job. You're abusing your power. And you're about to find out that there are consequences for that." Behind Sarah, the soldiers moved with quiet precision. They didn't speak, but their movements made it clear that they were there to ensure that nothing went wrong. Hayes wasn't going anywhere, not without answering for what he had done. Finally, after a long, tense moment, Hayes stepped out of the car. His legs felt shaky, and he was finding it hard to keep his composure. As he stood in front of Sarah, his mind raced. Was he being detained? Would he be arrested? Was his career over? Sarah took a step closer to him, her eyes locked onto his. "You pushed an elderly man. You treated him like he was nothing, simply because you thought you could. And now you're going to face the consequences of your actions." Hayes opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah raised her hand to stop him. "I don't want to hear your excuses, officer. What you did was wrong, and you'll be held accountable. The investigation will begin immediately." She nodded to one of the soldiers, who stepped forward with a clipboard. He didn't say anything, just handed the papers to Sarah. She scanned the documents quickly before turning back to Hayes. "You're being placed under investigation for excessive use of force and racial profiling," Sarah stated clearly, her voice calm but unyielding. "Until the investigation is complete, you will be detained here. You'll have a chance to explain yourself later, but for now, you're not going anywhere." Hayes felt a wave of panic wash over him. He had never been in a situation like this. He had always assumed that his position as a police officer would shield him from consequences. But now, in front of the military, surrounded by soldiers, he realized how wrong he had been. The soldiers began to carefully surround him, making sure that he didn't make any sudden moves. They didn't raise their weapons or shout commands, but the presence of so many highly trained individuals made it clear that they were prepared for anything. Hayes had no choice but to stand there, his shoulders slumped, feeling more vulnerable than he ever had in his life. The scene around him seemed surreal. Just moments ago, he had been in control, acting as if he were above the law. Now he was the one being controlled? The neighborhood, which had been so calm and peaceful just hours earlier, had become a stage for something much bigger. People were starting to gather in small groups, whispering to each other. Word was spreading fast. Everyone knew something important was happening. George, still shaken but recovering from his fall, was watching from a distance. He didn't understand everything that was going on, but he knew one thing for sure: the situation had changed. He wasn't alone anymore. The soldiers and the military presence around him were a clear sign that the injustice he had faced was not going to be swept under the rug. The crowd of onlookers slowly grew as the news spread. Some people were taking pictures with their phones. Others were watching with a mix of curiosity and relief. It seemed like the whole neighborhood had gathered, and each person had their own thoughts about what was happening. Some were just confused. Others were amazed by the speed at which the military had arrived. Sarah kept her eyes on Hayes. She could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that he wasn't going to get away with what he had done. She knew that this moment would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it, especially by George. This wasn't just about one officer's actions, it was about showing the world that justice could be done, that the powerful weren't always protected by their positions. As the investigation began, Sarah felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just about holding Hayes accountable, it was about setting a precedent. It was about showing that no one, not even a police officer, could get away with abusing their power without facing the consequences. She knew that this was just the beginning, but it was a crucial first step. Hayes, standing among the soldiers, finally realized how wrong he had been. There was no more running, no more excuses. The truth was out, and now he would have to face it. The soldiers began to escort him toward one of the military trucks. Hayes walked, his head hanging low, his once confident stride replaced with uncertainty. He had never felt so powerless in his life. Behind him, George watched silently, his heart still racing from the shock of the afternoon. But as he saw the military take control, something within him began to shift. For the first time in a long time, he felt that justice was within reach. He wasn't alone anymore. And that, more than anything, gave him hope. As the military trucks began to move, the neighborhood slowly returned to a sense of quiet. But things had changed. The old man on the bike, the police officer, and the soldiers would all be part of the story that everyone would remember. It wasn't just an ordinary afternoon, it was the beginning of something bigger. Something that would change the way people thought about power, justice, and accountability. The atmosphere in the neighborhood was tense but calm as the soldiers continued their work. The military trucks remained parked, and the soldiers who had surrounded Officer Hayes carefully made sure that everything was in order. Despite the calmness of the moment, everyone who had witnessed the events unfolding knew that things had changed. Perhaps forever. George Miller, the elderly man who had been pushed off his bike earlier, stood on the sidewalk, his legs still a little shaky from the fall. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. He couldn't believe how quickly the situation had escalated from a simple bike ride to something so dramatic. He had spent most of his life avoiding conflict, living peacefully and minding his own business. But today, everything had changed. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. The military's intervention had not just been a response to his situation. It was a message to everyone who had ever felt powerless or ignored. As the soldiers took Officer Hayes away, George felt a strange sense of relief. He knew that what had happened wasn't just about him, it was about fairness. It was about showing that people, regardless of their age, their race, or their background, deserved to be treated with respect. He had never expected to be the person at the center of such a moment, but here he was, standing on the street, watching the wheels of justice turn in a way he had never seen before. The sound of footsteps approaching broke George from his thoughts. He looked up and saw Captain Sarah Reynolds walking toward him, her expression calm but serious. George had seen Sarah from a distance earlier, and though they hadn't spoken, he knew she was the one who had made sure that the military had intervened. She had stood up for him even though she didn't have to. "Mr. Miller," Sarah said, her voice soft but strong. "Are you all right?" George nodded slowly, still trying to process everything. "I'll be okay," he said, though his voice was tinged with uncertainty. "It's just a lot to take in. I never imagined anything like this would happen to me." Sarah gave him a sympathetic look. "I understand, this situation is bigger than just one officer. But we're making sure you're safe, and that he will be held accountable for what he did." George took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in. I'm not one to cause trouble, but I knew something wasn't right. I just never expected it to get this far." Sarah gave him a reassuring smile. "That's what we're here for. We won't let things like this slide. People like Officer Hayes need to know that there are consequences for their actions. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." As Sarah spoke, George noticed the crowd that had gathered around them. It wasn't just the few people who had been around when the incident occurred. More and more neighbors had come out of their homes, drawn by the sight of military trucks and the soldiers standing guard. People were talking quietly to each other, some nodding in agreement with what Sarah had said, others shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. There was a sense of unity in the air, a feeling that this was a moment of change. In the distance, Officer Hayes was being escorted toward one of the military trucks. He was still in handcuffs, his face pale and his eyes darting around nervously. For a man who had once been in a position of power, the sight of him being treated like a suspect was a powerful symbol. It was clear that the military wasn't about to let him get away with his actions. This wasn't just about one person getting punished. It was about sending a message to everyone. No one, not even a police officer, was above the law. The soldiers, who had been standing at attention, now began to relax slightly as the situation seemed to settle down. They had done what they were trained to do, ensure that things were handled professionally and with order. The area was secure, and the next steps would be up to the investigators. Everyone knew that this was just the beginning of a long process. The investigation would need to uncover all the facts, speak to witnesses, and gather evidence. But in that moment, people felt a sense of justice. Officer Hayes wasn't walking away from this without consequences. George took another deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He looked over at Sarah, who had been watching Officer Hayes closely as he was led toward the truck. She seemed confident, resolute. George had never met anyone like her. She wasn't just a soldier. She was someone who believed in righting wrongs, someone who took action when it mattered most. He felt a deep sense of gratitude toward her, knowing that she had made all of this possible. "I never thought I'd be in this position," George said quietly, more to himself than to Sarah. "I've lived here for decades. I've raised my family here. I've seen good and bad, but I never thought I'd have to deal with something like this. It's hard to wrap my head around." Sarah nodded, her gaze softening. "You're not alone in this, Mr. Miller. What happened today isn't just about what one officer did. It's about making sure that people know they can stand up for what's right. No one should be afraid to speak out against injustice, no matter who they are or where they come from." George looked around at the people who had gathered. Some were talking in small groups, others were just standing there, quietly observing the scene. It was clear that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone. This was a moment that had brought the community together, a moment that was bigger than any individual. For the first time in a long time, George felt a sense of hope rising in his chest. Maybe things could change. Maybe people could make a difference. Just then, one of the soldiers approached Sarah. He spoke in low tones, updating her on the progress of the investigation and the steps that would be taken. Next. Sarah listened carefully, nodding occasionally as she processed the information. When the soldier finished, Sarah turned to George. "We'll make sure everything is handled properly," she said. "The investigation will start right away. Officer Hayes will be questioned and any evidence will be reviewed. We'll make sure that justice is served, no matter how long it takes." George nodded, though part of him still felt unsettled. It wasn't easy to shake the feeling of fear that had taken hold of him when he had been pushed off his bike. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he had been made to feel as though he didn't matter, as though his life was less important. It was hard to forget that feeling, even though things were starting to improve, but despite his lingering fear, there was something else rising within him. He was beginning to feel stronger. There was a sense of empowerment that came with knowing that the military had acted on his behalf, that people in power were being held accountable, that he didn't have to stay silent when he saw something wrong. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a shift, a change that would spread beyond his neighborhood, beyond the officers and soldiers, and affect something much bigger. The sound of a car engine broke through his thoughts. He turned to see a few police cars arriving at the scene, but this time the officers inside weren't rushing to defend one of their own. They were there to assist in the investigation, to ensure that the situation was handled fairly and with respect for everyone involved. It was a small but important sign that things were beginning to change. As Sarah gave George one last reassuring glance, she turned to speak with the incoming officers. George stood there, feeling the weight of the day settle on his shoulders, but also a sense of pride. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. He had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and yet he had become a part of something much larger than he could have imagined. The days that followed the incident were full of tension and uncertainty. The neighborhood had slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but there was no going back to the way things were before that afternoon. The events that had unfolded were impossible to ignore, and they were still on everyone's mind. People couldn't stop talking about what had happened, and whispers of change began to spread. The sight of military trucks rolling through the streets, the way Officer Hayes had been treated, and the support George had received from unexpected sources all made people wonder if things might start to shift in their community and beyond. For George Miller, the weeks that followed felt like a strange mix of relief and worry. The fall he had taken that day was still a physical reminder of what had happened, though the bruises on his body had faded. What weighed on him the most, however, were the emotional scars. He had spent his life working hard, raising a family, and trying to stay out of trouble. But what had happened with Officer Hayes had shaken him to his core. It wasn't just the shove, it was the way he had been treated, the way he had been made to feel like he didn't belong, like he was less than yet. In the months after the incident, George couldn't help but notice the way things had started to change. There were more conversations happening in the neighborhood about fairness, about justice, and about accountability. People were talking about what had happened, not just as a singular event, but as a symbol of something much bigger. It was a reminder that even in a peaceful place, things weren't always as they seemed, and sometimes standing up for what's right could lead to real change. The local news outlets had covered the story extensively. They reported on the swift response from the military, the investigation into Officer Hayes, and the growing support for George. It became clear that what had happened was not just an isolated incident, it was part of a larger conversation about the relationship between law enforcement and the community. And George's name, once quietly known only to those in his neighborhood, was now on the lips of people everywhere. His story had become a rallying cry for those who felt that their voices had been ignored, for those who had been mistreated but were too afraid to speak out. One afternoon, George was sitting on his porch, enjoying the sunlight and watching the world go by, when there was a knock on his door. It was Sarah Reynolds, the military officer who had made sure the situation had been handled with care. She had kept in touch with George throughout the investigation, checking on him regularly, but this time she had something different to say. "Mr. Miller," she began, her tone serious but warm, I wanted to let you know that the investigation into Officer Hayes has reached a conclusion. The findings are clear, and he will be held accountable for his actions. His badge has been revoked, and he's been charged with misconduct. He's facing a trial, and the community is rallying behind the idea that we need to ensure our officers are held to a higher standard. George's heart skipped a beat. The news hit him harder than he expected. He had been following the investigation, of course, but hearing that the officer who had hurt him would actually face real consequences felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders. He hadn't wanted revenge. He had just wanted to make sure that what had happened to him wouldn't happen to anyone else. But now, knowing that Officer Hayes was going to face a trial, it felt like a small victory, something that validated the pain and frustration he had felt on that day. I don't know what to say, George responded, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't expect this. I didn't think that something like this could actually change anything. But now, I guess I'm starting to see that maybe it can. Sarah smiled gently. You did something important, Mr. Miller. Your courage in speaking out, in standing up for yourself, has made a difference. And the people who have supported you, whether they're here in this neighborhood or across the country, are showing that change is possible. It won't be easy, but this is just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the trial against Officer Hayes was widely covered. The community rallied around George, offering their support through letters, protests, and public statements. They made it clear that they stood behind him, that his pain mattered, and that they wouldn't let the officer's actions go unchecked. The trial was long and emotionally charged, but the evidence was clear. Officer Hayes had used excessive force and had targeted George unfairly, all because of his personal biases. The trial became a public spectacle, a reminder of the power that accountability could have in shaping a community. As the trial came to a close, the verdict was announced. Officer Hayes was found guilty of misconduct and racial profiling. His badge was permanently stripped, and he was sentenced to a significant period of time without pay, his career in law enforcement effectively over. For George, hearing those words in the courtroom was both a relief and a reminder of the pain he had endured. The courtroom was quiet as the verdict sank in. People in the gallery exchanged glances, some nodding, others wiping away tears. It was over. But it wasn't just about one officer. It was about the hope that this would send a message to others, people in power who thought they could act with impunity. For George, the verdict was bittersweet. It didn't erase what had happened, nor did it take away the fear he had felt in those moments when he was shoved to the ground. But it gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of justice. The realization that his story mattered, that his voice had been heard, was a powerful feeling. It wasn't about revenge, it was about making sure that the world understood that no one, no matter who they were, should be treated with such disregard. As the weeks turned into months, the community began to heal. People who had once felt powerless in the face of injustice were now coming together in ways they never had before. They were advocating for change, demanding accountability, and standing up for each other. George saw it in the way people treated one another. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves were now speaking to each other more openly. People were coming together to create a safer, fairer environment. The sense of unity that had grown in the wake of the incident was powerful. It was clear that George's experience had inspired something in the people around him, a desire to build something better, something more. In the years that followed, the changes that started that afternoon continued to ripple through the community. Laws were passed that emphasized police accountability, and the relationship between law enforcement and the citizens they served began to shift. There were still challenges, still moments where people felt uncertain, but there was also hope. George had become a symbol of the power of speaking up, of standing firm in the face of injustice, and of believing that change was possible. For George, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about knowing that he had helped make the world a little bit better. It was about seeing the faces of his children and grandchildren, knowing that they would grow up in a world where they could expect fairness, where they could trust that right would be done. And as he sat on his porch one last time, watching the neighborhood come to life in the golden light of the evening, George finally felt at peace. The journey he had gone through had been difficult, but it had led to something meaningful. It wasn't just his fight, it had become the fight of an entire community. And that, he knew, was the greatest victory of all.